October 1969. A razor-thin ridge overlooking the A Shau Valley, South Vietnam. The ambient temperature is 95 degrees Fahrenheit. But inside the triple canopy jungle, the humidity makes the air feel like boiling water. A sudden burst of heavy machine gun fire tears through the dense green foliage, and within 3 seconds, an American infantry squad is cut to pieces. 2 men are killed instantly, their bodies slumped over rotting logs like discarded sandbags. A third man crawls backward into the mud, clutching a shattered thigh, screaming into the suffocating heat. The rest of the squad is pinned down behind the decaying roots of a banyan tree, unable to move, unable to see the enemy. This is happening every day. Every single day, somewhere along the jagged, mountainous border, where the North Vietnamese army has drawn an invisible line across the jungle. The American grunts are running out of ammunition. Their radio is dead, spitting out nothing but static and the distant, mocking distortion of an enemy frequency. The wounded are lying in the dirt, their blood mixing with the stagnant swamp water, while leeches and black flies swarm their open flesh. Outside their tiny perimeter, an elite NVA sniper team is tightening the noose, waiting for the remaining Americans to stick their heads up. But the man who is about to make a choice on this ridge is not an army hero. He is not an officer whose name will be remembered, nor a general with a biography already half written. He is just another forgotten face in a war full of them. A 19-year-old drafted private from rural Oklahoma who had spent his youth hunting white-tailed deer in the brush. A boy who had been told by his drill sergeants that his quiet nature made him unfit for the raw brutality of jungle warfare. His name was Bobby Vance. And before this afternoon is over, he will not save the world, nor will he alter the course of the war. He will simply make one quiet, terrifying decision, and the men who survived would spend the next 50 trying to forget the look on his face when he did it. To understand what Bobby Vance did on that ridge, you first need to understand that this was never a story of military glory. It was a single, microscopic slice of a conflict that devoured thousands of boys just like him. It is a story about the weapon he carried, and the unspoken rules of a war where the enemy was completely invisible. And that story begins not on the ridge in October, but months earlier in the red dirt of Fort Polk, Louisiana, and later on a sweltering supply track near Da Nang. Bobby Vance wasn't a volunteer. He was a boy from a dry dirt farm outside McAlester, Oklahoma, where the horizon was wide and the only thing louder than the wind was the Sunday sermon. Before the draft board pulled him into the gears of the military machine, Bobby's world was defined by the cyclical rhythms of the harvest and the quiet geometry of the woods. His father had taught him how to hunt when he was barely 9 years old. It wasn't a sport for them. It was a means to put meat on the table when the cotton crop failed. His father used to tell him, standing in the freezing dawn of the blackjack oak forests, "Bobby, a bad hunter shoots with his ears. A good hunter shoots with his eyes. But a master hunter doesn't shoot until he can hear the animal breathe. You don't force the woods to show you its secrets. You let the woods forget you are there." Bobby learned the heavy discipline of stillness. He could sit at the base of a hickory tree for 6 hours without moving a muscle, his fingers wrapped loosely around his grandfather's old Winchester bolt-action rifle, letting the frost build up on his canvas coat until the birds would land on his shoulders, completely unaware of the predator beneath them. When the draft notice arrived in the spring of 1969, his father had looked at the government seal, his calloused hands rough against the crisp white paper, and said nothing. He simply folded it and laid it on the oilcloth kitchen table, his eyes tracking the dust motes spinning in the fading afternoon light. In the selective service lottery, Bobby's birthday had been drawn as number 14. His fate was sealed before he even learned how to shave properly. He was stripped of his Vietnam clothes, his long country hair shorn to the scalp, and replaced by a serial number and a set of olive-drab fatigues that smelled of factory starch and industrial insect repellent. At Fort Polk, Louisiana, the training ground known grimly as Tigerland, the drill sergeants tried to break the country out of him. They yelled until their throats bled, trying to instill what the military called the killer instinct. They gave him an M16 rifle, a weapon made of black plastic and stamped metal that felt like a flimsy toy compared to the heavy wood and steel of his Winchester. The instructors built simulated Vietnamese hamlets in the sticky Louisiana pine woods, complete with hidden tripwires, punjis pits smeared with human waste, and cardboard targets painted to look like guerrilla fighters. They forced the boys to sprint through the red clay mud until they vomited, barking the same mantra into their ears day and night. In the jungle, if you hesitate for a single heartbeat, you are a ghost. There are no second chances in the bush. But Bobby didn't yell back. He didn't pick fights in the barracks or spend his weekend passes drinking cheap whiskey in the neon-lit bars outside the base gates. He kept his boots shined, his brass buckles polished, and his mouth shut. His drill instructor, a scarred staff sergeant who had earned 2 Purple Hearts during the 1968 Tet Offensive, once pulled Bobby out of the formation, shoved his face inches from Bobby's nose and barked, "Vance, you're too soft. You've got the eyes of a church boy. The NVA are going to eat your liver before you even unholster your canteen. You lack the venom it takes to survive." They didn't understand that Bobby's silence wasn't fear. It was observation. He was studying them just like he studied the wind patterns back in Oklahoma. He knew how to isolate a single sound out of a symphony of background noise. He knew how to become completely invisible by simply refusing to react. July 1969. The 101st Airborne Division is grinding through a search-and-destroy operation in the lowlands near Da Nang. The progress is measured not in miles, but in casualties. The jungle consumes men faster than the rear echelon can send replacements. Every functional rifle is a critical asset. And Bobby Vance, along with his squad, has been humping a 70-pound rucksack through the elephant grass for 90 consecutive days. The heat was an active, malicious enemy. It rotted their utility uniforms off their backs until the fabric shredded like wet paper under the weight of their gear. It turned their leather boots into soggy bags filled with sweat, mud, and fungal spores that ate away the skin between their toes until they were walking on raw flesh. During the afternoon monsoons, the sky would open up, pouring down a sheet of warm, blinding water that did nothing to cool the air. Instead, it turned the jungle into a green steam bath where the skin couldn't breathe. They were exhausted, their faces hollowed out by sleep deprivation, their eyes permanently bloodshot from the salt of their own sweat. Their minds were warped by the constant, agonizing anticipation of a hidden, bouncing Betty landmine that would clip them at the waist, or a sudden, deafening sniper round from a tree line that looked identical to every other tree line they had passed that week. Every single step was a high-stakes negotiation with death, a roll of the dice where a mistake meant a closed-casket funeral back in the States. The squad was a fractured collection of boys pulled from every corner of America. There was Miller, the squad leader, a 20-year-old corporal from New Jersey, whose face had hardened into stone after his best friend was vaporized by a tripwire tied to a mortar shell. There was Kowalski, a big Polish kid from the steel mills of Pittsburgh, who spent his nights crying silently into his poncho, and Doc, a 19-year-old conscientious objector from Oregon, who carried bandages instead of bullets. They had no shared history, no common ground, except for the collective terror that bonded them together. At night, they would huddle under makeshift shelters made of nylon ponchos, listening to the massive artillery barrages miles away. The earth would tremble, a rhythmic, heavy thumping that felt like the heartbeat of some ancient, angry god hidden in the mountains. The United States military operated on a doctrine of overwhelming firepower. The high command in San believed that napalm, heavy artillery, and B-52 bombers flying at 30,000 feet could burn the enemy out of the jungle through sheer material attrition. They called it body count diplomacy. But on the ground, the 19-year-old grunts quickly learned a completely different lesson. The enemy didn't fight a conventional war. They didn't build massive fortifications or try to hold territory just to plant a flag. They operated on absolute, terrifying patience. They would wait in pitch-black underground tunnels for days, weeks, breathing through bamboo tubes, just for the perfect moment to step out, fire 3 precise rounds into the center of an American patrol, and vanish back into the green abyss before the artillery could even clear its barrels. The men of Bobby's squad knew the grim statistics. They knew their chances of making it to their 365-day Deros date, their golden ticket home, were dropping with every sunrise. They trained themselves to look for the tiniest anomalies in the brush. A strangely bent twig that didn't match the surrounding growth, a patch of dirt that looked just a fraction too loose, a sudden, dead silence among the birds that indicated a human presence. But no amount of basic training could prepare a country boy from Oklahoma for the psychological horror of a weapon that became the ultimate dark emblem of the Vietnam War, the Zippo lighter. In the official military manuals, a $3 brass Zippo bought at the base PX was just a utility tool. It was meant to light a Lucky Strike cigarette, melt the frayed ends of a nylon poncho cord, or burn away a giant black leech that had crawled into a soldier's sock and attached itself to his ankle. But on the ground, the Zippo was undergoing a grim, unauthorized evolution. The grunts took their combat knives and river sand to scrape off the shiny chrome plating, stripping the lighters down to the raw brass underneath. They did it for survival first. The reflective chrome could catch the fierce tropical sun and give away their positions to a sniper waiting a kilometer away. But more importantly, raw brass tarnishes. It reacts violently to the environment, changing color based on sweat, tropical rain, gun oil, and fear. The soldiers watched their lighters turn a sickly greenish black in their pockets, recognizing their own internal psychological decay in the stained metal. They began using the tips of their bayonets to engrave their true, uncensored thoughts onto the brass casings, truths they would never dare write in letters to their families back home. One man in Bobby's platoon had carved, "We are the unwilling, led by the unqualified, doing the unnecessary, for the ungrateful." Another lighter, carried by a machine gunner from Chicago, who would lose both legs a month later, simply read, "If you want to go to heaven, you have to go through hell. And I've got a permanent pass." The Zippo had become a pocket-sized gravestone. The men carried them nom in their left breast pockets, directly over their hearts, with the silent, mutual understanding that if an AK-47 round claimed them, that scarred piece of brass would be the only honest artifact recovered from their bodies. It was their ultimate record, an uncensored diary that the Pentagon could never redact or spin into a victory speech. But it was what happened on that hot morning near Da Nang that changed Bobby Vance forever. His platoon had entered a small, thatch-roofed village suspected of harboring enemy supply lines and providing food to local Viet Cong cadres. The village was named My Loc, but to the military bureaucracy, it was just a coordinate on a topographic map. The order from the platoon leader, a second lieutenant, fresh out of officer candidate school, who was terrified of failing his body count quota, was clinical and absolute. Pacify the sector. Burn it down. Bobby found himself standing before a small hut woven from dried palm leaves and bamboo poles. Inside sat an elderly Vietnamese woman, her face lined with the deep geography of an 80-year struggle, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap, her black eyes staring blankly at the dirty canvas boots of the American soldiers. She didn't scream. She didn't beg for mercy. She simply waited with an ancient, exhausting endurance. She had seen the French army burn her village 20 years ago. Now she was seeing the Americans do the same thing under a different flag. Bobby's squad leader, the 20-year-old corporal from New Jersey named Miller, stepped up. His face was a mask of cold, unyielding fury. He pulled out his brass Zippo, flipped the lid with a sharp, metallic click, and flicked the flint wheel. An amber flame rose, steady and indifferent to the human misery around it. Corporal Miller didn't hesitate for a second. He touched the flame to the dry thatch of the eave. The fire caught instantly, exploding into a roaring furnace of thick white smoke and crackling wood. Bobby watched the old woman scramble into the dirt, clutching a single woven basket of rice, her entire existence reduced to ashes in less than 3 minutes. The intense heat pushed Bobby backward, the smell of burning palm leaves and scorched earth filling his lungs, turning his green uniform black with soot. In that single, suffocating moment, the grand architecture of Bobby's purpose crumbled into dust. The patriotic speeches about saving a nation from totalitarianism, the flag-waving parades in McAllister, they felt like a sick, cruel joke played on 19-year-old boys. He wasn't a liberator. He was standing in the smoke of an innocent person's home, holding a weapon of pure destruction. He didn't wash the black carbon off his hands that night, when they returned to the base camp. He wanted it there. He wanted to feel the greasy, heavy residue of his own guilt every time he touched his face. That evening, by the light of a single candle in a defensive bunker, while the rain poured outside, Bobby took his own Zippo. With the tip of his hunting knife, his hand shaking so violently he nearly cut himself, he carved 5 words into the raw brass. Jesus wept, and so did I. By October, when the squad was deployed via transport helicopters onto the razor-thin ridge overlooking the A Shau Valley, Bobby Vance was no longer the quiet boy from Oklahoma. He was a dead man walking on a 365-day lease. The ambush on the ridge had ground down to a standstill, a psychological war of attrition where time was measured in droplets of blood. The NVA sniper was dug into a fortified spider hole somewhere in the dense bamboo thicket, his camouflage so perfect he had become part of the mountain itself. The position of the American squad was catastrophic. Doc, the corpsman, had been shot through the chest while trying to drag the first wounded man back to safety. Now, both men were lying out in the open, in the kill zone, a 20-meter stretch of mud cleared by machine gun fire, where the grass had been chewed down to the roots. Every time an American soldier tried to lean out from behind the banyan roots to lay down covering fire, a single precise 7.62-millimeter round would snap through the air, punching into the wood just inches from their eyes, showering them with splinters. The sun was dipping below the canopy, and the shadows were elongating, turning the jungle into a maze of terrifying illusions. In another hour, It would be pitch black. In the dark, the squad knew the NVA infantry would crawl up the steep slopes of the ridge and finish them off with bayonets and grenades. Corporal Miller was bleeding from a shrapnel wound to his shoulder, his teeth chattering as he gripping the dead radio receiver. "We're done, Vance," he whispered, his eyes wide with a frantic, unblinking terror. "Nobody is coming for us. They're going to slit our throats when the sun goes down." Bobby looked at him, then looked out at the open mud where Doc's body lay perfectly still. The country boy didn't feel like a savior. He just saw a tiny, brutal chore that needed to be done if he wanted to see tomorrow. Bobby Vance crawled away from the banyan tree, leaving his rucksack, his heavy web gear, and his steel helmet behind. He took his Zippo out of his pocket, his thumb running over the jagged, hand-carved letters, in the dark. He didn't light it. He just listened to the mechanical click-clack of the lid. He was doing the cold, hard math of a hunter. The sniper wasn't shooting blindly out of panic. He was waiting exactly 4 seconds between shots, to let his barrel cool, and to acquire his next target without giving away his position through sustained muzzle flash. Bobby had calculated the distance of that flash during the last shot, approximately 80 meters out, slightly elevated, hidden beneath a cluster of wild banana leaves near a gray limestone outcrop. Without saying a single word to Corporal Miller, Bobby began to crawl into the high elephant grass. He didn't use the standard low crawl taught by the book at Fort Polk. He moved on his belly like a timber rattlesnake, using his elbows and the toes of his boots to slide through the rotting vegetation, leaving no visible trail behind him. He pressed his face into the wet earth, inhaling the smell of decay, of old leaves turning to peat, a smell that was exactly the same as the swamp bottoms back home. The jungle was trying to reject him, but he refused to be rejected. He became stone. The minutes stretched into an eternity. A large black ant crawled across Bobby's eyelid, its tiny legs scratching his skin, but he didn't blink. A cloud of mosquitoes swarmed around his neck, biting through the grime, but his muscles remained locked in absolute stillness. He was waiting for the woods to forget him. He was waiting for the sniper to believe that the only Americans left on that ridge were the terrified boys cowering behind the banyan tree. Every muscle in his body burned with the effort of constraint. He could hear the blood rushing through his own ears, a heavy, rhythmic thumping that sounded exactly like the grain elevators of Oklahoma. He measured his progress not in feet but in inches. He would move an arm, slide a leg, wait 2 minutes, then move again. He parted the green blades of grass with his bare fingers, his nails caked with black mud, listening for the faint click of a rifle bolt or the rustle of a uniform fabric that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the wind. At exactly 1740 hours, the sky turned a deep bruised purple. The air pressure dropped suddenly, signaling an impending monsoon rain. The NVA sniper, sensing the change in the weather and knowing his visibility would soon drop to 0, shifted his weight to adjust his sight on the remaining Americans behind the banyan tree. He needed one more kill before the darkness covered his retreat. He leaned forward just a fraction of an inch to clear his line of sight through his scope. A single banana leaf rustled out of turn, not with the wind, but against it. It was a movement so slight that no city-born boy would have ever noticed it. But to Bobby Vance, it was like a flare going off in the dark. Bobby didn't think about courage or medals. He rose from the grass, his rifle locked firmly into his shoulder, his eyes focusing instantly on the tiny V-notch of his iron sights. He didn't fire on full automatic, knowing the muzzle climb would waste his ammunition. He took a short breath, held it in his lungs, and fired 3 consecutive, controlled rounds into the dark center of the foliage. A heavy, wet thud echoed through the thicket, followed by the sound of a heavy object sliding down dirt. Then, absolute silence. The birds didn't even sing. When Bobby pushed through the sharp bamboo, his rifle raised to his cheek, he found the sniper slumped over the lip of his underground spider hole. The hole was a masterpiece of combat engineering, aligned with sturdy bamboo logs covered in living moss, virtually invisible from 5 feet away. The sniper was young, perhaps 18, wearing a faded green uniform and a hand-woven pith helmet covered in jungle foliage. He looked like he could have been Bobby's brother, if his brother had been born on the other side of the world, in a rice paddy, and instead of the Oklahoma plains. He was holding a Soviet-made Mosin Nagant rifle with a pristine PU sniper scope. But what caught Bobby's eye was not the bolt-action weapon. It was what lay on the dirt ledge inside the hole, next to a half-empty tin of rice ration, a shiny, silver, American-made Zippo lighter. Bobby reached down and picked it up. He flipped the lid. Click. He turned it over. On the chrome surface, a previous American soldier from a completely different unit had engraved, Youngstown, Ohio, 10, 0 Zenud miles to nowhere. The realization hit Bobby like a physical blow to the chest. The sniper hadn't bought this at a base PX. He had taken it from the pockets of a dead soldier weeks or months ago. He had used the American flame to light his own Hoang Kiem cigarettes, while waiting in the dark to kill more of them. The lighter had crossed the Pacific Ocean, changed hands through blood and violence, and now it was here, shining in the twilight of the A Shau Valley. Bobby looked from the silver lighter to the face of the dead boy in the dirt. There was no triumph in his chest, no rush of adrenaline, no feeling of heroic victory. This wasn't a turning point in history. It was just one boy from Oklahoma standing over a dead boy from Vietnam, both of them chewed up by a machine too large for either to understand. There was only a vast, empty coldness that seemed to bleed out from the center of his bones. He didn't say a word. He didn't show the silver lighter to Corporal Miller when the evacuation helicopters finally arrived an hour later under the cover of darkness to haul the bodies and the hollowed-out survivors away. He simply slipped the silver Zippo into his left breast pocket, right next to his own greenish-black brass lighter. For the final 5 months of his tour of duty, Bobby Vance carried 2 Zippos. They rattled against each other inside his uniform shirt with every step he took through the elephant grass, a constant, mechanical click-clack that sounded like a countdown timer toward his departure from this earth. One lighter marked the distance to a home valley he was no longer sure he belonged to. The other carried the stolen memory of a dead grunthind from Ohio who had never made it back to see the factories of Youngstown. The brass and the silver didn't care about the geopolitical strategies debated in Washington, the domino theory, or the grand historical narratives of the Cold War. They simply sat close to Bobby's skin, absorbing the salt of his sweat, the black grease of his gun oil, and the heavy, silent grief of a boy who had survived the physical jungle, but had left his soul behind in the ashes of a burning country. When his 365 days were finally up, Bobby didn't celebrate or cheer. He boarded a charter flight out of Tan Son Nhut Airport in March 1970. When the commercial airliner lifted off the tarmac and the grunts inside erupted into wild cheers and tears of joy. Bobby just looked out the small oval window at the green canopy disappearing into the clouds below, his pocket rattling with that same familiar sound. Click-clack. He returned to Oklahoma. But the decade that followed was a slow, agonizing slide into oblivion. The 1970s passed over him like a gray fog. He took a job at the local grain elevator, working the grueling night shift from midnight to dawn 'cause the roar of the heavy grain machinery was the only thing loud enough to drown out the silence of his own thoughts. The townspeople didn't ask him about the war. They were too uncomfortable with the defeat, too eager to forget the images they saw on the evening news. He became a ghost in his own hometown, a man who spoke only when spoken to, who walked along the edges of the roads rather than the sidewalks. He never married. He never went to town council meetings. And he never wore his veteran's cap to the July 4th parades, choosing instead to sit on his porch in the dark, while the town celebrated a glory he knew was a lie. By the time the 1980s rolled around, his hair had turned a premature silver, matching the chrome plating of the lighter in his pocket. His family noticed that he carried a strange, unbreakable habit that seemed to control his entire life. Whenever the air pressure dropped, whenever the sky turned that deep, bruised purple before a summer tornado storm, Bobby would reach into his shirt pocket, pull out 2 lighters, and hold them tightly in his calloused, trembling palms. He would close his eyes, flip the lids, and listen to them touch. One lighter was cold silver, the other was stained, heavy brass. To anyone else, they were just old pieces of metal, junk from a war best forgotten. But to Bobby, they were the 2 halves of his fractured life. The brass lighter held the boy from Oklahoma who had died in the smoke of my luck. The silver lighter held the boy from Vietnam who had died in the mud of the A Shau Valley. They were locked in a permanent, silent embrace, 2 enemies bound together by a common tragedy. The presidential unit citations and the official military histories would publish grand, multi-volume books about the campaign in the A Shau Valley, detailing troop movements, strategic hill numbers, and ammunition expenditures down to the last round. The generals would receive shiny medals, and the politicians would write lucrative memoirs about peace with honor. The veterans of Vietnam knew the bureaucracy would simply wait for them to die of cancers caused by Agent Orange before acknowledging the raw, unfiltered truth of what happened on those ridges. But the truth didn't require a medal or a marble monument in Washington, D.C. to exist. It didn't care about who won or who lost. It existed in the permanent, pocket-sized ledger of a 19-year-old's guilt. It existed in the mechanical snap of a lighter lid closing in the dark, a sound that would follow Bobby Vance all the way to his final resting place. In the red dirt of Oklahoma, long after the fires of the jungle had gone cold. If you had been in Bobby's position on that ridge, would you have carried the dead man's lighter, or would you have left it in the dirt where the war found it? Does an object carry the guilt and the ghost of its owners, or is it just a piece of stamped metal? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more raw stories that peel back the myths of military glory to find the human heart underneath, make sure to hit subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching, and let's discover our history together.